Hello and welcome to Console Shock episode 37, Retro and Modern Gaming Chat with me, Trev, and Stuart from Playnation Games. Hi, Stu.
Hi there, Trev. How are you?
Yeah, it's been a long time, isn't it? We've had a fairly big gap, unfortunately, since the last one. We keep saying
I've been away on holiday to the Far East, so it's just life has taken over.
It does from time to time. Yeah, we're not full-time YouTubers, unfortunately. It would have been it's a lovely career if you can get it and have millions of subscribers, but we're not really there yet, are we, with that? We'd probably never be, unfortunately, but that's fine.
You never know. I think we've got to put, in our thumbnails, we've got to put girls in bikinis.
Oh, yeah, with a big clickbaity title.
Yeah, we've got to put, watch this girl, she's going to do something crazy.
You won't believe what happens next.
Yeah, Sega Saturn.
With like a little round dot with a arrow pointing at it, just in a random point in there, not in an actual relevant thing, just randomly pointing somewhere.
Exactly, that's what we need to do. We need to
tap that market.
Yeah, exactly.
So we're back again. So it took a big gap, as I say. We've been off and doing other live things. Don't worry, we do. You know, we'll always try and make this every 2 weeks if we can. Yeah. But unfortunately, we've had a bit of a gap. But slap on the wrist for all of us for doing that. But we are back with a guest who we've had on before on the show, very recently, actually. It's Random Gamer Riven. Hi, Riven. Thanks for coming on again.
Hi, no worries, guys. Nice to talk to you again. Nice to see you.
Yeah, it's been great having you on last time. We had a great chat about the lovely way we were sort of, fleeced out of getting good 60 hertz versions of things, or because of our lovely TV standard that didn't quite match up to the Americans and the Japanese.
Yeah, I mean it's still interesting. I've been doing comparing a few more games, and there's more titles than you think are optimized, and it really is a real mess.
I want to know. My collection is getting worse with every video that you put out when it comes to the PAL stuff.
Yeah, after we did the Daytona one, that was just painful going through the changes between the NTSC and the PAL version.
God. Yeah, I popped a few comments on that saying that I was just to happily play that and be fairly ignorant of all this stuff.
Yeah, I think we all were when we were younger, but there comes a point where you suddenly realise. I think the turning point for me was when I came back from holiday one year, having played Marvel Superheroes versus Street Fighter in the arcade. We got back, we put on the Marvel, just the standard Marvel Superheroes, and then sports loaders, the boards, the huge screen borders. We were like, yeah, it might be time to sort this issue out.
I do remember though, in like I mean, Stu, you might know as well, we're having done our own shops and stuff. In like the magazines of the time, there would be like when I have the bits that would have adverts for shops. There would often be adverts for import shops, and big things like 60 hertz. Get your US Genesis 60 hertz, 60 hertz. Oh, it was like, what is this 60 hertz thing? Obviously appealing to people that know this stuff. So they'd go and buy, they would know to buy a Genesis.
I mean, I'm so fussy now about, making sure I've got all the right cables and a nice TV and everything. Yeah. But I remember when I was a kid, I would just, the machine came with, I think our TV in the living room, it was an old, actually, I moved this into my bedroom when I was a kid. And this was my TV. It was actually a Sony, but it was a wooden frame, and it didn't even have a SCART or any sort of AV input, so I had to put an RF in there. But I was like, what do you mean there's other ways of doing it? I had no clue. And I'll tune it into channel. There's only 6 buttons, so you go channel BBC 1, 2, ITV, channel 4, and then you would have your video game machine
permanently tuned in.
And some of them would have a pretty good picture, and then some would have a little bit of a not quite as good picture. But so you had to sort of fine tune it, but then you had to fine tune it back again for other systems. But I was just, that's the way it works. You get a little bit of interference.
Aerial. I used to have our black and white as well, and you do the fine tuning. You sort of fine it, squiggles a bit, and you type to get it just right, and then.
Yeah,
so I think the epiphany for me came when we got the Saturn, because that was, of course, in Europe and certainly in the UK, that came with RGB SCART standard. So
I actually picked up my CDX. I've actually kind of semi-retired it because for one, the CD side of it is really fussy with CDRs. I've burned a couple and it just won't play them. Yet my Mega CD 1 is, I can chuck any old crap at it and it'll play them, which is a bit weird. And also, it's a US system. You get the jail bars. Even you get the image is clean with an RGB cable, like a really nice one from the retro gaming cables dude. I always buy the sort of my SCART cables off, but there is a jail bar effect on it. I know you can fix it with a mod, but I got a PAL, that Asian PAL Mega Drive, not Japanese.
Oh, the Hong Kong one.
Yeah, I got a mod.
It's got the purple on there, hasn't it?
Yeah, and I got it. It's been modded already. It's only about 40 quid. It was actually not a bad deal. And I've just plonked that on top of my. But I've dug out the Mega CD 1, which I actually got off you, Stu. So thanks for that. It's having a second life now. And I've plonked that on my unit where all my gaming stuff is, and I've got that on top of it. You don't need to mod the Mega CD to play a 60 hertz Mega CD game because the video output is the Mega Drive. So as long as that's modded for 60 hertz, and then I've got the EverDrive in my Mega Drive, so I can load the BIOS for whatever region I want to play my Sega CD or Mega CD game from, and I've kind of got the perfect setup now. And the great thing is that there's no jail bars. It's got really perfect, crisp RGB out the back of that particular Mega Drive. So yeah, my CDX has kind of gone into retirement a little bit. Power Rangers is what did it. I've got the American version of that, and it's slightly scratched, and my CDX will not play it. But again, chucked it in the Mega CD. It was read it like a dream. Could be that maybe the CD drive's getting a bit wear or something. But trouble with those CD-based consoles, eventually they're just going to completely conk out. And hopefully by then we'll all have kind of SD card things we can add into them, and which already exists, don't they? But I'd love one for the Mega CD, like that, like the Super SD system that's come out for the PC Engine. If someone can make a Mega CD version of that, I think we'll be
through the. If you've got a Mega Drive or a Mega CD with a Mega Drive in, then you have an EverDrive, and you can put the Mega CD files.
No, you can't. You can't run ISOs. No, because it has to go through the interface on the side. There's something about that interface that is.
Okay. So I know you can do 32x games through the EverDrive if you've got a 32x in there, obviously.
They're completely different ISO files. They're images, and they need to go through the interface on the other side. Doesn't rule out someone building a little MacGuffin that you could pop into the side that you'd be able to put an SD card into that pretends that the Mega Drive looks like a Mega CD, and it will stream the ROMs through it or the ISOs. So yeah, maybe someone will invent that. You don't happen to know anybody you could nudge, do you, to make this for me?
No, that's a great idea, though.
It'd be an you put an FPGA on it, those lovely little sort of chips you can program to pretend to be a CPU of some or a chip of some kind, which is what's in the SD to SNES. I don't know if you've ever heard of those, but that's the EverDrive for the. It's not an EverDrive, but it's a flash card for the Super Nintendo, but that can pretend to be. Not only can it run the ROMs, but it also has an FPGA that can pretend to be some of the enhancement chips that you get in Super Nintendo games. Like you can actually only literally in the last month, you can now play Super FX games through the SD to SNES. So you can now finally play. It came out in 2011, the SD to SNES. And only now, some random dude just decided to try and get them working. He got them working within like a week, and you could play like Doom and Yoshi's Island and Starwing, and you can even he's added an option to increase the speed, so that you get a smoother frame rate than you would with the original kart, which is amazing. So yeah,
you'll even be able to do the new Starwing 2 now, because I saw that was like dumped within hours of the SNES Mini coming out. That's quite funny.
Yeah, I've played it on the SD to SNES on a real on a Super Famicom, and it runs great. And you can put on the fast option, and it will be a little bit smoother, which is great for. It benefits Doom a hell of a lot, because Doom is a fair bit smoother now. Still not like PlayStation version smooth.
Yeah, it was something. I think it's like 15 frames. I think the Super. Yep, it's 15. I think 20 to 15 or something. It's not good.
I still play it because I'm just amazed by how it's running on a Super Nintendo. But yeah, it's a bit better now. So if you were thinking about getting an SD to SNES, but you unfortunately couldn't play your Super FX games, that has now been solved. But there are still some chips that it can't do yet.
Yeah, it'll be like Far East of Eden, which is one of the custom chips they built for that. One of the variants of the memory ones, and same with the chip used for Street Fighter Alpha as well too.
Yes, which had Star Ocean, I think.
Star Ocean. It's weird. Far East of Eden used a slightly different variant to something that basically works similar to the Star Ocean one. I've actually got all three of those in genuine SNES cartridge form. Brilliant games, brilliant. Actually, Far East of Eden Zero is a real pain because that actually has an internal battery for the clock, and I had already had that die once on me when I originally got it. So I replaced it. That's the same as like any Game Boy game, with which if they've got an internal clock, then the battery dies after only a couple of years, 4 or 5 years max.
I'm waiting for them to put that it's the STD1 chip because I really like Street Fighter Alpha 2 on the Super Nintendo. No, it's not the biggest, far better version you can play, but I actually quite enjoy the Super Nintendo version. But
it's a very good version. For the console it was released on, it's very, very good. But in comparison to the Saturn's version, it's laughable. But for the SNES, it's a brilliant port.
It's expensive as hell though for the PAL version. A couple £100 at least. Actually, you're better off just getting the Super Famicom version, which is common as hell.
Yeah, I got the Super Famicom version. There are a few people who like to try and claim the Super Famicom version's rare and expensive, but I think I paid like £20 for it a few years back, not that long ago, actually. Partly, I would quite like a PAL copy for just purely for having a PAL version, but one of those games that you look and think, I don't really want to pay the cost for an inferior version, basically.
Yeah, there's a similar story with a game that I've recently been playing a lot, which is Dracula X or Dracula XX on the Super Nintendo. That or Vampire's Kiss, as it's called, on PAL. But
that goes for insane money. I never saw that once. I remember reading the reviews, thinking, "Oh, when's this coming out?" Never saw it once for sale.
Yeah, and I mean, Rondo is my favourite Castlevania, but I quite like the Super Nintendo one.
Yeah, I quite like it as well. I've got the Japanese version. It's weird. There was an awful lot of SNES games that got reviewed, that got released in PAL, and you never used to see. I think a lot of them were ended up released in Germany, or some of them, I think, literally were distributed in places like London, and that was it.
That's weird, isn't it? Yeah, you see the odd one pop up on Dracula X. There's a lot more US.
Down to a lot of people who bought their games. You literally had a Woolworths in your shop in your town, and that's the only place you could buy games. And if the buyer of Woolworths said, "Oh, this is a rare Japanese game that's it's got slightly adult themes," no, Woolworths doesn't want that. So if you didn't go, through a magazine and buy it through one of the the select people there, and send off a check, and then 2 weeks later it'll turn up, you didn't get it.
Yeah, I mean, I remember the next.
I vaguely remember those times. You did actually used to get those shots, just the reams of adverts. So obviously, like you said, a lot of them were just literally mail order only.
Exactly. But there's the only way you can do it.
It's quite funny. I've moved to Beckenham, and I went through an old games magazine, and I found Riven Games. I don't know if you ever heard of those.
I've used them in the past. They used to be in Bromley, London. I think they're still down there.
That's it. They're literally. I say I could throw a stone, I'd hit it. I might be able to hit a golf ball to where they are. They're just down the road from me.
Nice.
And Raven Games, and they do all records now, and American hip hop hats and stuff. But it's still the same people sort of running it. And I went there a few years ago, and there's loads of great retro stuff. They might still have it out the back or something.
Well, they have games though.
I probably went there about 5 years ago, and it was full of games. Now when I go past there, it's all records and American hip hop rarities. Which, if you're into that, that's great. But I remember seeing those guys in magazines selling super guns and really sort of cool import stuff, and they were a real sort of, well, I say they're a big player. They were advertising in Mean Machines, and they looked like they had loads of great stuff, and they were the same price as everyone else. But it's just so interesting how that's how people sort of used to buy games. And
there was an article in Euro.
Changed. I mean, I've never saw the import scene when I was younger because, of course, I'm probably a little bit too young. But you just hear tales and thinking, yeah, that was quite cool. I think because for me, I never really got into the importing till the Saturn era. Because for the SNES, I just used to see it in the magazines. And the thing is that even the official Nintendo magazine back in the 90s, they used to review hundreds of import games. I've got the issue that reviewed Chrono Trigger, another one that reviewed Front Missions. I remember looking at these thinking, wow, these look great. When are they getting released? And of course, they never did.
Yeah, you didn't understand the politics behind it then. You just assumed, oh, that's going to come out here at some point because everybody gets the same games, right? You know? But yeah, and it's... Oh, I used to get the occasional American like magazine, like Electronic Gaming Monthly, and you get like Super Mario RPG be in there, and I'll be waiting for Woolworths to get that, and I'll be like, why is it not appearing? Obviously, there'd be no commentary on this might not get released in PAL regions because of this and the other. Like years later, that this stuff is like.
You always got the habit. I remember when the NES was like the big thing, and I brought this magazine, and it was talking about Super Mario Brothers 4. You know, oh, it's out in Japan. It's this.
Oh, yeah.
What the next one's out? Oh my god! And it's literally we got it.
We got 3.
I'm making up numbers now, but a year later,
we got 3 in '91, I think. The PAL version.
I think we got 3 after Super Mario World had actually released.
Nintendo were really with that.
Yeah, they were. Yeah,
they
removed the Super Mario 4 subtitle from the Japanese box. It's got Super Mario
4,
but that got removed for the Western release, which seemed odd because that sort of complements it. And yet, weirdly, for Yoshi's Island, they added the subtitle Super Mario World 2 when it isn't. It's a completely different game.
Yeah, so I mean, the Super Nintendo itself, I mean, that came out here in 1992. It had been out in Japan since '90. You know, the Mega Drive was pushing sort of 2 years old by the time, you know, the Super Nintendo came out over here, which I think is a big reason why the Mega Drive won.
Yeah, I think the SNES was way too late. Nintendo hated Europe because the NES didn't sell particularly well. But then,
yeah, exactly.
The thing is, they released the NES so late, and by then the Amiga was out, and the Amiga made the NES a laughing stock.
Yeah, you're not gonna pay £70 for a Super Mario game, are you? When you can
get that looks inferior to an Amiga game that costs £20. I mean, because Amiga games were £20 to £30, they were very reasonable. Nintendo, I mean, that's why they got clobbered because they were just too greedy back then. I mean, they just.
Yeah. Well, I think, to be honest with you, I want to say this is a bit of a controversial statement, but in the sort of the 80s. Nintendo were the EA of now because they had some really sort of, I think, quite nasty practices. And
definitely.
Yeah, I completely agree. I still think they do some, but yeah, carry on.
But I was going to say, and also, if you made your games on other systems, well, no, you can't make that game on Nintendo. So they were sort of the market leader, and they really, abused that position. And it wasn't until a little bit sort of later on in the lifespan of the Mega Drive that you started to get Probotech to come out, or Contra, or things like the Castlevania games. They came out a little bit later on. And
I think Konami sort of started releasing those games for the Mega Drive because they had bloody hell, there's this entire huge user base now for this Sega thing. We might have to start making games for that. And the same with Capcom, you know, Street Fighter 2 was you didn't say any Street Fighter 2 or Mega Man.
I mean, that was the first.
Yeah, Capcom were actually the ones that basically put an end to that whole Nintendo contract. They were the ones that found the loophole to get out of it.
I think wasn't that why we got Championship Edition on the Mega Drive, because that wasn't covered by the exclusivity.
Yeah, exactly. It was Street Fighter 2 on the SNES.
Yeah.
Then on the Mega Drive, it was Street Fighter 2 Championship Edition, and you're like, oh wow, this is a different version of it.
It's the better version by default because the Mega Drive controller is perfect for the 6 button is.
Yeah, the 6 button.
Yeah,
for the game.
Really nice.
I find it hard to play Street Fighter 2 with a Super Nintendo pad. That's why I always tend to just default to the Mega Drive editions, and Super Street Fighter 2 especially. I think actually is genuinely better.
It's got more animation on the Mega Drive, I understand. I've not actually played the Mega Drive version that much, only very briefly. I need to actually grab a copy at some point. But admittedly, I don't play Street Fighter 2 these days on the SNES or Mega Drive. I hate those conversions now. I just think, why play those when you can play the arcade perfect version? That's my opinion these days.
The closest one, I mean, we did a video on it, didn't we, Stu, when we were doing the video versions of this show, but the 3DO version is one of my favourites, even though that isn't actually close to the arcade. At the time, everyone was saying it was arcade perfect, or people were saying that about the Super Nintendo version, because it was just a sort of a line you threw out in a magazine, wasn't it? To make you go, whoa. But yeah, the 3DO version, the sprites are smaller, and they are missing some animation, but and the backgrounds don't move as much. Well, there isn't layers. I think there was as many layers, background layers.
It was pretty close. I think
it's pretty close.
Yeah, I think the Saturn and PlayStation versions are just about arcade perfect. I don't think they're 100%. I think they might be missing 1 or 2 frames. I might be slightly wrong there, but I think the Saturn and PlayStation versions were sort of the first that were arcade perfect, and then the Dreamcast they released Turbo on, which is
that's the first one, wasn't it? Yeah, and I think the big one that I was just the thing I noticed when you compare them is obviously to cut amount of memory it would have needed to store the game, was that none of the characters have a backwards walking animation, which is different to their forward walking animation, which is in the 3D version does actually have the forwards and backwards. But it's interesting about the Mega Drive Super Street Fighter, because I think that's on a 40 megabit cartridge, whereas the SNES is 32 megabits. So I'm guessing Nintendo charged more for higher store capacity cartridges than Sega.
Probably.
Sega, knowing that, you know what, if we really go for it and give them a cheaper cartridge, you know, they'll potentially want to make we can say we've got the better version of the game, which is why there's so many more voice samples, and I think probably like you say, more animation. But I've never actually watched a direct comparison.
Yeah, you have to sort of watch direct comparisons. Interestingly, that's not the only time they did that, because there are a couple of European releases where, if you look at Fatal Fury Special on SNES, if you compare the Japanese version to the PAL version, they used a smaller cartridge and cut out a couple of the characters. Same with Double Dragon 5 Shadow Falls. They obviously knew that having not sold well in the US, they cut down the cartridge size for the PAL version and cut out characters. So just for an added insult, they just said, yeah, we'll give you a crapper version of the game.
So talking of like Sega versus Nintendo and Sega versus everyone, really, themselves included.
Yes, mainly themselves.
What we're going to talk about now is what would happen if we had, like, let's say Sega made some different decisions, mainly in the mid-90s, and they followed a different path to what they actually did in our reality. How do you think the various console wars would have panned out? So I've got some scenarios that I'm going to throw out to you that have happened in an alternate reality. And if they would have made a difference, maybe no difference, maybe completely changed the fabric of video gaming. So the first one I'm going to fling out to you is, so the Sega Saturn, in this alternate reality, it's the same console. So is the PlayStation 1. The specs are the same. They look exactly the same. But the Saturn, let's just assume the PlayStation does everything the same that it did in our reality. But the Saturn, in this reality, it's come out in September of 1995, let's say the same week as the PlayStation. So I guess that was near the end of September. And it doesn't have any more games. We could probably say that the games that we got in July, I think when it came out, or June when it came out in the UK, came out in September, but they would have probably gotten the extra couple of months of development time. That probably wouldn't mean they'd be significantly better, but maybe they would have got a bit better PAL optimizations, or they might have bug fixed them.
In the older days, a couple of months was huge development time. You could massively change a game given an extra month or two, because back then games were an awful lot smaller to develop.
So we can explore that. So all those games came out, same ones, not saying any new extra amazing ones came out. Same games came out, but probably a bit better bug fixed because there was more time. And it cost the same as the PlayStation. It was 300
I was going to say that's important.
I'm not going to give an advantage to the Saturn particularly by saying it came with 10 games or something stupid like that. It'll probably have just a demo disc or nothing, probably more likely. You'd have to go and get a bundle from whatever, Woolworths or someone. They'd have to sort of sort you out a game. But that's it. Comes out in September of 95, later than it did originally. Same price as the PlayStation, same games, but they've had that extra development time.
So what
do you guys think?
Now from that one, they would have definitely lost that one. They would have had a slightly better start, but they'd still lost it because you still had Tom, how do you pronounce his surname again?
Kalinske, yeah.
Kalinske making that infamous Sega of America blunder. The Saturn would still have been difficult to code for. Sega still would have kept the code back, which they did, where they said, oh yeah, we'll keep our best sort of hidden code for our team so the other developers won't know how to code for it. So you've still had all the same things would have pretty much occurred the same, I think.
I think it probably would have sold more, and you think that might have encouraged programmers to be I don't know if it's making more of an effort.
A little bit, but not a huge amount, because the Sega would. You have to remember, Sega and Nintendo were incredibly arrogant during that period. They both believed they would trounce Sony, and that was the bottom line. That was ironically, it was the curse of the third. Really, almost every third generation goes a bit awry. Technically,
that's right. Yeah,
it's weirdly it's the third in the West and the fourth in Japan, so that does apply as well, because the Saturn did quite well in Japan. In fact, it did better than the Mega Drive and the Dreamcast by quite some margin. I think it did better than both of them combined as well, but the Mega Drive didn't do that well in Japan, and of course the Saturn failed. The N64 didn't do particularly well, and the PlayStation 3 had a rather rocky period, and the less said about the Xbox One, the better. There's definitely the curse of the third, I believe.
It is, yeah. It's interesting, isn't it? Because the first console a company just chucks out there, hoping they'll do well, and maybe it does really well. It might do phenomenally, in fact. And then they have the second one comes out, and they just coast off the first one. I would probably say this is what happened with the PS2. They did make good decisions with it, though. And then the third one, they're like, yeah, we are the kings. We can just throw any old crap. People will still buy it. The developers will still develop for us because they can't not, and we'll make some ridiculous thing and put 7 CPUs in it because 7's a nice sounding number.
Yeah, they did try to put
Draghi here, and we saw what happened there.
Yeah, they lost hugely. I mean, I don't think there's any. Weirdly enough, I don't think there's many games that actually really use the full potential of the PlayStation 3 either, because so few people.
I would say
it has a similar architecture to the Saturn in that there's so many CPUs in it, no one knows how to really use them. And it was supposed to have 8 CPUs originally, wasn't it? But too many of them were faulty out of the factory, so down to 7. But yeah.
Well, I think we had this. When we were chatting with John Linneman a few episodes ago from Digital Foundry. I was talking about how most people around 2011 would say Uncharted 3 you could never make that on Xbox 360. It's literally impossible. You need all those 7 CPUs and everything. And I'm like, well, no. If you play Rise of the Tomb Raider on the Xbox 360, that game looks freaking amazing for an Xbox 360. A PS3
things like Gears of War. So many games look just as good.
Yeah. I mean, I would say Rise of the Tomb Raider is the ultimate in terms of like a third person, just because it's the most recent game, and they made a really good job with downporting it, I suppose is the word.
They did that with Titanfall as well. The down really, really good. The 360 version is incredibly close to the Xbox One. I mean, it's not quite as shiny, but it's literally all there. I think that was suggested one of the reasons why they slightly delayed it as well. Because it's too close.
It was weird. Like as it Respawn, they said, "Oh yeah, unfortunately, the Xbox 360 version didn't matter. It wasn't up to the standards that we set ourselves." I was like, "Guys, that was amazing that you managed to stuff that into a completely fully playable version of the game with everything in it."
And graphically, it's very close as well. There's not a huge amount of difference. It's a few of them is like, Well, the thing is, ironically, most PS4 games and Xbox One games could be done on the 360 and PS3. You just have to turn down the graphics a bit.
Yeah, you can say that even now. Obviously, there'll probably be huge loading times between areas that are very expansive.
Yeah, pretty much. That's it.
You could do them. They might have to tone the resolution down. Might even be less than 720p, but you could do it. Get a bit of popping, but you could probably live with it. I mean,
because the thing is, hardware tech has kind of slowed down, and the simple fact is, to make photorealistic games now is just not economically viable.
Yeah, I mean, I still play 360 fairly often.
I still play mine.
Yeah, I've got such a big back catalogue, and I don't put a disc in and think maybe that very, very first generation of games, like I played like FIFA 06, that really bizarre 360 release.
The World Cup one, Road to the World Cup.
Yeah, it was like a launch game. Literally within about a month, there was about 1 billion of them in like CEX and like all that, because like the people would there was no modes in it really. There was just like a campaign that lasted about an hour. It's good for Gamer Store though.
Quite funny one because everyone that was when I started working in the industry and everyone was just laughing about it because I said, well, why is that? So why are you buying the PS one? They said, yeah, it's got no modes in it. It said the PS2 version's got all the modes.
Exactly, yeah. And the actual World Cup game came out like about 4 months later, so you just got that instead. But the player models look pretty crap. They've got this thing that they love doing on early 360, like tons of bloom and things that are slightly behind the thing you're supposed to focus on. They just blur out completely to get some kind of a cinematic effect, and the players have looks like they've been covered in slime. So they've all got this weird sheen, this very to show like the shaders and off basically the graphic artist went mental. You can I've got all these cool like effects I can add, and they just went mental, but it doesn't look real at all. But that's all the only football game we had for about 4 months, so it served the purpose.
Do you want to hit us with your next scenario then and see what?
Yes. Okay, so we don't think much would have changed.
I don't think much would have changed, no.
Even at the same price and everything. I think a lot of people were burned already anyway on the 32X and the Sega CD. So let's just say the 32X was never released. So all the same Mega Drive stuff happened, all the same Sega CD stuff or Mega CD stuff happened, but they never released the 32X. And in fact, I would say they actually took the SVP chip and they actually decided to make a few more games for that to kind of bridge the gap between the Mega Drive and the Sega Saturn. So how do you think that would have affected things? No 32X, so potentially
I think that would have made a huge difference because I think people were, scarred because, the Mega Drive and then you got the Mega CD and then you got the 32X. It was just, it felt like Sega kept on asking for your money. So if I think it went from, the Mega Drive, which, we all loved, it was a great machine. And then the next thing was it created a load of hype because the problem is, the games that came out, I'm talking about Virtual Fighter, that came out on the 32X. And then it was one of the launch titles for the Sega Saturn. But in reality, we've sort of had that before.
Exactly, yeah.
We've all, hold on, we've seen that. We've seen Virtual Racing, and we've seen sort of pretty poor, not the best versions of it. So I would sort of argue that, actually, it would have created so much hype, so much build-up, and, so much more excitement for the next machine if we weren't sort of drip-fed, certainly with the 32X and with the Mega CD to a lesser extent, all this sort of little upgrades, and it went from the Mega Drive to the Saturn. That'd been such a huge leap, and I think that would have made a massive difference to the sales of the Sega Saturn.
I'll tell you what that would have told me is that would have said Sega of America and Japan weren't fighting one another because, of course, the 32X was the brainchild of Sega of America because they wanted to try and do the 32-bit console and they were fighting with the Japanese division. So if they hadn't had the 32X version, you would have found that probably, or the 32X basically, they probably wouldn't have been infighting, so had been cooperating. So in theory, then you'd have probably found we'd have got a better Saturn, so probably something more powerful machine because the divisions aren't slogging and fighting one another.
Yeah,
I would say, they would probably have a much more fairer outcome. I mean, there'd still be slightly. I think Sega would still be making a lot of mistakes, but you would have had a slightly better, more adhesive company, because I think one of the big problems with Sega during that era was it was just tooth and nail. I mean, every story you read is about how the US division was fighting the Japanese one on almost just everything, whereas if you didn't have the 32X, it meant the US division weren't pouring half their cash into developing what was effectively a dead duck, and instead pouring into the Saturn. So we'll assume that they probably spent money on investing new Sega games, so there probably would have been more titles at launch and probably better looking titles as well. So that would have certainly had a favourable launch that I would definitely go with.
And there, if you think about for the Saturn, there wasn't really a proper Sonic game on there.
No,
So you had all these amazing Sonic games on the Mega Drive, and why didn't they go? Okay, maybe Trev. One of the questions you should have asked was, would the Sega Saturn have been a much bigger success if it had a Sonic the Hedgehog game? You know, a platformer, whether it's 3D, 2D, pseudo 2D, 3D even.
Well, just thinking now, you could have done an absolutely stunning 2D Sonic the Hedgehog on the Sega Saturn that probably would have been just phenomenally lush looking, vibrantly animated, sort of looking more like a cartoon. I think that would have, I mean, at the time that might have got a bit of a rough ride, but I think had you had a Saturn get Sonic game like that.
But do you remember Clockwork Knight? That was basically a 2D game with sort of 3D backgrounds.
Yeah, I mean, Clockwork Knight, I mean, I've got them both. In fact, I've even got the double pack they released in Japan, which is a load more extras. And it's a nice game. It's not great. It's not patch on Sonic the Hedgehog. I mean, it's a good game. They're quite nice games. They've got some nice ideas, but they're not a patch on Sonic the Hedgehog. Interestingly, I don't know if you've seen that Polygon Panda Dracoon Saga interview recently that they had, where basically they were interviewing him. Apparently one of the guys in that, or at least one of the interviews I've seen recently, if it's not that one, basically said Sega at the time regarded all the old franchises as Mega Drive things, which is why they wanted to do loads of new IPs on Saturn, which I really like the idea. They did lots of new IPs, but I can see that the fact that they didn't carry over Sonic the Hedgehog, they didn't carry over Streets of Rage, they didn't carry over Phantasy Star, that was in the long run a big mistake.
I think it was because people would buy a Saturn on the strength of those games. I mean, how many people most people migrated from the Mega Drive, certainly to the UK, the Mega Drive to the PlayStation. So, you know, obviously the Mega Drive was the #1 seller in the UK. That's obviously not true of the world, but so yeah, they would have gone from Mega Drive to PlayStation because there's none of these games I used to have. I'm not really getting new versions of them. Virtua Fighter. What's that? You know, unless you go to arcades all the time, you might necessarily be enamored by that. And also, there were probably more Tekken arcade machines in the UK because it was on cheaper hardware. So you probably would find if you wanted to go to something because it's a game you're familiar with, you might end up doing that to the PlayStation. I'm not sure about a 2D Sonic game because all the magazines and everybody were kind of enamored with the idea of polygonal games.
I think that would be, if they'd released a 2D Sonic game, it would probably have got pillared at the time, and these days be like praised as the greatest Sonic ever made.
Sonic CD. Sonic CD. I don't remember people saying then. You got good reviews then. A lot of people saying you have to get a Mega CD for Sonic CD. It's friggin' amazing. It's the best Sonic game ever. And obviously now you can pick up a Mega CD for 20 quid. You know, and everyone's saying Sonic CD is the best one ever. I didn't really start hearing that until about 10 years ago.
Yeah, after I played Sonic CD, I realised what a fantastic game that was. It's weirdly, it was intended as like Sonic 2, but by the time in development, you can actually see they had the Sonic 3 logo. They had planned for it to be Sonic 3 as well at one stage, and that's actually in game. There's actually a 3 logo, but instead of the 3 eyes. But basically, Yuji Nakai had hissy fits over that, so they didn't.
So it would have been interesting to see what they would have done. I personally think in that scenario with no 32X, I would love to have seen the SVP chip used. I know it's expensive, but I think if they started mass producing it, they might have been able to knock the price down. And if they did release the rumored separate SVP chip pass through, like the Sonic and Knuckles cartridge, so you could pick that up for 50 quid. And then you could pick up, they might have done a Virtua Fighter, somehow. You could get that for less, or you can get a version of that with the chip inside it if you've done that.
It probably would have been better than a Virtua Fighter 2 released on the Mega Drive.
Yeah, exactly. And
that was awful.
Maybe you could have got some kind of like a SNES style port of Doom using the SVP chip. I know the SVP chip is actually more powerful than the Super FX chip.
Really? Because I was surprised because the only game I really played on the SVP, in fact, was it the only game they released was Virtual
Racing?
It was,
yeah. It runs about twice the frame rate.
Yeah, it's virtual. For me, the Mega Drive version of Virtual Racing is just terrible. It's
not the one you'll play now, is it?
No, it's one of those things. I even when I played the time for the FX chip's better than this. It's weird. I think perhaps developing that chip and not only releasing one game with it was perhaps a huge mistake on Sega's behalf.
I think, yeah, if they focused on use that as their gap, and also I think it would have benefited. Well, it would have benefited the Mega Drive. It obviously did still get support. What up until 1997, really. There was only a handful of good 1 or 2 games that year, but you would have probably found more games that have been released. Like the Super NES had, more games in that sort of last 2 years than the Mega Drive did. I think you would have found that would have been more equal, and I think. You probably would have found the Mega CD would have got more games as well. Problem, they may well have been just enhanced ports, but they maybe again more units would have got sold of the Mega CD, so they want to drop the price more quickly. You get good bundles with it at that point. You probably would see, there would have been a Mortal Kombat 2 CD. There might have been even like completely unique Mega CD games, but more ports of PC Engine CD games, like we got. Lords of Thunder and a handful of other ones that we got, but we'd have probably more of them. So I think everything would have benefited all round, and I don't think people would have got that impression that when the Saturn rolled around, even if that all happened the same way, like it still came out early and all that stuff at a higher price, people wouldn't necessarily have that chip on their shoulder with them. Where I bought all this gear that you've dropped, how I'm not going to do that again for the Saturn. So yeah, that's how I think that would pan out. I think it would have benefited. Would it have meant the Saturn would have been successful? Yeah, I don't know. Maybe not. It might have ended up being the same, but perhaps that would have been a better plan than just releasing the Saturn at the same time at the same price.
Well, if you want one alternative scenario, remember the Sega of America head was talking to Sony at one point.
Yeah.
And because basically having been rejected by Nintendo, they did approach Sega. So you could have had the Sega PlayStation, or it may have been the Sega Saturn PlayStation. And you can imagine that if they had done that, I suspect they'd have probably rejigged the hardware. So you wouldn't have had the PlayStation, you wouldn't have had the Saturn. You'd have probably something more powerful and just better across the board. Now, could you imagine what happened if Sega had basically been with Sony? They'd have almost certainly now been one company, and they would have annihilated Nintendo.
Absolutely. God, that's a crazy.
I think PlayStation won that round, not really with hardware, but they won it really with two things: marketing and getting other sort of publishers on board. And I don't know what carrot that they dropped in front of all the Namcos and all the different sort of companies.
I think the fact it was easy
to make all their games.
It was very easy to program
on the PlayStation. What was the big reason that people made the Tekkens and the things on the PlayStation rather than Sega Saturn?
Well, I think it was easy to program for starters, and they went around and they would actually offer lots of support to developers to help them program their console. Whereas Sega,
but I do think Stu also hit the nail on the head. They were willing to market it. It was, as you say, a friendly machine. They really were willing to push it. I mean, because they basically did everything they could to undermine the Saturn, while at the same time supporting development on their own console and marketing. I mean, you just think the PlayStation adverts, even now, I can still think of them. I didn't necessarily like them, but it was such a heavy TV presence back in the 90s, whereas the infamous Saturn adverts, I remember they had the Pet Europe, you had a couple of them where it was Kyoto and I, with some dry-boned Japanese guy would go, UK, that may be too hard for you.
Oh, yeah. It was like, that was for like Worldwide Soccer and Daytona and very weird abstract ads. Whereas the Mega Drive had great, cool ads, Pirate TV and all that stuff, and I don't know if they changed agency or if they thought that was cheesy or something. Then you had like the PlayStation had like Saps, which sounds cheesy, but it was a really effective, jokey kind of advert. And then you had the great, the one that had that monologue of all those different people.
Yeah, the one that goes, I've commanded armies and conquered worlds.
It was just awesome. And they just, it helped that they were a massive company who knew how to market devices.
Yeah, I mean, when you look some of the stuff, I mean, they did pay for developers not to release games on opponent systems. So Core certainly bought out with Tomb Raider. Some of them were even paid to say the Saturn was crap. There has been some suspicion Doom was a buyout as well.
So that's why the Saturn
version was a bit rubbish. Yeah, there had been some suggestion based, but a load of them. I mean, for instance, Square Enix actually had a Sega Saturn development, or SquareSoft back then, actually had a Sega Saturn develop. Yeah, because Enix actually released a few games on the Saturn. SquareSoft never did, but SquareSoft supposedly did have a Sega Saturn development kit and never used it.
It's interesting because they were fairly. I recall them having lived through it. Obviously, all of us have. I recall them being fairly neck and neck. My impression in terms of the games on like the shelves for the first year. And when I actually look now at like second-hand stores that sell, PS1 and Saturn games, even on eBay, I often find there's way more copies of like Magic Carpet on the Saturn version. There's way more of them, like High Octane, all those kind of weird kind of first-year releases. There's loads more copies for the Saturn version. It's because they just overprinted too many copies.
I think there's just a little bit less to buy on the Saturn. So, oh God, a new game's coming out. Oh, we've got to get it. Whereas on the PlayStation, maybe in that time, 3 or 4 games came out. And
I'm sure there wasn't in that first year. There was a lot of. The PlayStation maybe had a few more, but I think I don't know what the figures are, but they had a decent load each. I don't think one of them was dramatically more than the other. Not like N64 v PlayStation sort of levels,
Yeah. Although, admittedly, if you were buying High Octane, you were in for an extremely poor experience on Sega Saturn. That game was atrocious.
It was.
I know the PC version is supposed to be quite good, but the Saturn version was just dire. Absolutely dire.
They had a decent whack at it in those days, Bullfrog, on the Saturn. I think Syndicate Wars does it come out for the Saturn as well?
No, it was apparently developed but cancelled. But they did. I mean, they did a great port of Theme Park. In fact, they did 2 ports because they did a Japanese version which had a load of Japanese themed rides, and then they did the sort of the standard Western version as well. I mean, like I said, you got Magic Carpet.
That's right. Yeah,
High Octane.
Yeah, and like I said, like for some reason, those games, the sort of Saturn version seems to be a lot more common if you want to pick them up. Whereas like even things like Earthworm Jim 2. Like the Saturn version is like sort of 20 quid, and the PlayStation version, people are wanting 40 and 50 quid for it, and you'll see maybe 1 copy of that, whereas there'll be like 4 of the Saturn version, or like Cool Spot Goes to Hollywood. That's another weird, one that came out in that first year. There'll be loads more Saturn copies. Yeah, probably just the case that they just printed way more copies.
I'd actually argue that the PlayStation was marketed towards sort of older players, so people were buying the Wipeouts, the Gran Turismo. Maybe they came out a little bit later, but more of the more adult, gritty games. Whereas the kids who loved Earthworm Jim for when they were younger, they more maybe migrated to the Saturn because it maybe had we had a Mega Drive before, now this is sort of the next machine. So with that type of game,
I do think the PlayStation did have they did go for a slightly more adult lineup, and I think certainly the older kids all wanted a PlayStation over a Saturn in some regards, because when you looked at the Daytona USA port was pretty terrible in comparison to Ridge Racer, so I mean that really didn't help. And Wipeout, I mean you look at some of the early sort of PlayStation exclusive games. I know Wipeout did get ported, but it got ported so much later that really the PlayStation had it exclusive long enough, so sort of the Saturn's version didn't have much extra.
Yeah, but I mean, I'd argue that Daytona USA is a better game than Ridge Racer. Technically, obviously, Ridge Racer is better, and literally, technically, like in frame rate and everything. But I think if you put both of them in front of me now, I'd probably choose Daytona USA every time. I think just because maybe not the PAL version.
I know what you mean. Yeah, I think Ridge Racer is dated very badly, whereas Daytona is a fantastic game. In fact, if you compare even Tekken 1 compared to like Virtua Fighters 2, like Tekken 1, 2, and 3, they're all rubbish compared to Virtua Fighter 2. Virtua Fighter 2 has stood the test of time. The early Tekkens haven't. It's interesting how things have changed, but at the time, of course, Sony had the branding, and those brands were really big, and Virtua Fighters was basically getting hammered. It didn't matter, it was the better game. In Sega Rally eclipses just about anything ever released driving wise on the PlayStation, takes it all to pieces. I mean, it's a game with 4 tracks, but it's such a masterclass. But
it's such a good feeling game.
Yeah.
Because to me, you're talking about what was better, Ridge Racer or Daytona. Either one of those, I can't control the car. It goes off. I feel like I have no control over it. But Sega Rally, and that's a game that's sort of really, like, it's a series that's really annoyed me, because I so enjoyed Sega Rally on the Saturn. Then the Dreamcast version was just controlled awful. Never liked it.
Oh, you're on ice.
The one on exactly, the one on the Xbox 360 was absolutely awful. Then there was a PSP version, and
the
PSP
whole
series has just gone.
Yeah, there's quite a few. So you have Sega Rally, you have Sega Rally 2, which is the arcade one. You then had Sega Rally 2006. With a PlayStation 2 release. That's pretty good. Supposedly, I don't know whether that was actually Sega Rally 3, because supposedly there were a couple of interviews where they basically said they'd pretty much developed an original Sega Rally 3 in arcade. They had wranglings over the cabinet, and I don't believe they ever released it. No, they didn't release it, but it was the state it was completed in. We don't know how complete it was, but basically that was never released. They then did Sega Rally Revno, which was done by a UK studio who really did not get Sega Rally at all. I know there's the PSP one. The best one more recently was Sega Rally Online, which I think Sumo Digital did, and that also got released as Sega Rally 3. That wasn't bad. It still didn't quite get the feel just right, because one of the problems with all those games is they get the track design wrong. One of the iconic things about Sega Rally, and this is true why Daytona and Sega Rally is such good racing, is every part of those tracks is unique, and you can visually see the track as each of the bends, because they're each designed to look and feel very differently. From, like, on the first Sega Rally course, you have the long straight at the end with the animals on the side, and as you approach the thing, the helicopter comes down. You've got the bits in the mud where you jump over the hills, the hard chicane at the end of that. You've got the opening turn with that soft turn into the gravel, and then the mud, and it's visually very appealing, and each of those is visually signposted. The same with the forest, the desert, and lakeside. Well, and mountains, actually, no, but basically it's, and even Daytona at the same time, things you don't see track design to that standard on any other game. I mean, you get a lot of realistic, really boring looking courses, the realistic ones, but that track design in Sega Rally and Daytona is phenomenal, because they made every bit of those tracks unique, both visually and how you play them. Until someone can produce a racing game again with that type of design, you won't get anything anywhere near as good.
Yeah, I think the only thing that comes close on, like, the PlayStation, although it's not a very good game, is Burning Road, which is that weird Daytona rip-off game that they made for the PS1. It's kind of weirdly enjoyable.
I've never heard of that. I have to look that up after.
Burning Road, yeah. The graphics even look like a Saturn game. I don't know if that was on purpose or they were just a bit crap at programming. But they're very blocky, really low-resolution textures. But it's very much like Daytona, the track design especially. And I mean, I completely agree with what you're saying. Like, I think in the mid to late 90s, Sega were just the absolute, well, probably most of their arcade history, they were the absolute kings of racing games. Even games that didn't come out on console, like Scud Race, had great track design. Daytona USA 2. There'd be tracks where you'd go underwater into, like, tubes, and you'd have these huge mountains and big glass-fronted, like, buildings and big bridges and all that. Even like Virtua Racing, that big forest track. I just like just racing around to look at stuff, not even to, like, you know.
Yeah, exactly. Again, Virtual Race, you say that. I always remember the Ferris wheel at the end of the opening easy course. It's just iconic. That's how you do good track design. And I don't think almost any designer, because that was always the profession I sort of wanted to be in sort of games, because although I did sort of QA and testing and sort of did a bit of sort of management, the design, and because I picked that all up, but I've just seen no one's been able to replicate it anywhere near as good. They just haven't grasped that you need that sort of visual thing matched with the sort of handling to get it just right.
I mean, that Namco did a pretty good as well, especially with the first Ridge Racer, like that initial going into the tunnel. Yeah, going into that tunnel with the Spacer or the Gallagher on playing above it and all that stuff. That was like, and the when you hit the tunnel and all the lights and everything, it kind of blows your mind a little bit. But I think the only game that like recently that I can think, or semi-recently that I got that kind of feel is probably Outrun 2006.
Yeah, I agree. That Outrun's probably one of the more better recent ones. I know they did the Sonic Racing games, which Sumo did, but they kind of didn't quite as much as I mean. I have actually worked with some of the Sumo guys, so I did actually work with them on Split Second because I did that, and I actually worked.
That's a good game, Split Second.
Yeah, it was an interesting one. Maybe that's just some stories for another time. It didn't. I don't think it turned out as well as what we'd hoped, but they kind of get it the feel similar with the Sonic Racing games, but they overdo it a bit with nostalgia, and they didn't quite grasp some of how you needed to do the tracking. So they look quite visually good, and but they tend to be a little bit too much of a rush of nostalgia and less on actually driving that well. The Sonic Racing games, they're good games, they're not great games. That was my sort of opinion on those ones, but they've got some interesting designs that you don't tend to see that much. So it's certainly worth checking out the two Sonic Racing games they did.
Yeah,
on a third one now as well, actually.
Yeah, well, there's another one coming out, isn't it? I think they teased recently. I actually tried, as a sort of fan of the Ridge Racer games, I actually tried Ridge Racer Unbounded, which is the last Ridge Racer game, and it was just crap. That
was some Western Dev one. Yeah, I was watching my brother play through that one. It was not good.
That's like an open world game, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's not really. I don't think it was even ever supposed to be a Ridge Racer game. They just kind of tacked the name on at the end.
Yeah.
Just to kind of get some brand recognition, but it's more like Need for Speed, but not even as good as Need for Speed. The whole thing goes as about like a drifting mechanic, which is what all the Ridge Racer games are about, but really over the top to the point where the drifting is an actual dedicated button, and there's a very specific way that you have to trigger it for you to not to crash into the side. And there's weird things like you can make scenery blow up and stuff, and it's just not like Ridge Racer at all. I would love something. There was that Kickstarter, wasn't there, for 90s classic arcade racer or something a few years ago, and it kind of completely fell off the radar for some reason. The guy,
I think that one is that the one that got released in the USA, and then the publisher basically turned around and said, "Oh, it's too complex to release in Europe because we've got to go through all the different boards and stuff and go through the different countries," so they didn't bother releasing it in Europe, which is just aggravating. Well,
Sega made that. Is it Sega Racing Classic, which is literally Daytona, isn't it, without the license?
That was actually the Daytona release they did on the Xbox 360. That is Sega Racing Classics.
Yeah.
Basically, they released it in the arcade. It did well in the arcade, so when they released it for the home port, they actually paid for the Daytona license.
The 360 one, yeah, which is absolutely perfect, isn't it? It's the first time it's been.
Yeah, that was the first truly arcade perfect version of Daytona. I'm so glad they released that version.
Yeah, it's a long time coming. We got teased by the Dreamcast one, didn't we? But that was, I think we talked about that last time you were on.
Yeah, let's not go there.
let's not get the bad memories. So one last one. There's obviously time's getting on. A bit of an open-ended one here. So what would it have taken for the Dreamcast to beat the PS2? Now, a lot of people say, "Oh, if it had a DVD drive, that would have done it." I don't think it would have, because it would have been really expensive.
I think I'll say it in one word. Well, actually, about 5 words. EA and the FIFA games and the Madden games.
Yeah,
I think that's what it needed, because people, they didn't want.
FIFA,
everyone likes Coca-Cola. No one likes Roller Cola.
My argument with that, a lot of people say if it had FIFA, everyone would have bought it. We got to remember, in 1998, FIFA wasn't the best football game.
It doesn't matter. It doesn't. It was the best-selling game.
It may have been a terrible game in 98, 99, but still well. Oddly enough, I would actually say all Sega needed to do was not cancel the Dreamcast, because at the time they just smashed the PlayStation in Europe and the US. The PS2 had been you don't hear about this much, but the PlayStation 2 got absolutely thumped that final year that they cancelled.
Yeah. Was that because of the price drop, or do you think people were genuinely just buying it because they wanted this is cool, or yeah? What do you think triggered that?
the Dreamcast, basically, a lot of people have been pushing the Dreamcast, and basically, Sony had been very, very arrogant at the start of the PS2 because they'd tried to do Nintendo saying, "Oh, the demand's so high, we won't be able to produce enough machines." And sure enough, they got thumped at Christmas. And I remember, like a week after Christmas, hearing some guy say, "Oh, I heard you're out of stock of PS2," and then some guy in the shop said, "No, they got beat by the Dreamcast, so they're suddenly rushing in the stock into shops." He said, "We'll have loads of stock in for next week." Because basically Sony had actually been thumped, but as soon as Sega then a month later said we're cancelling the Dreamcast, bang, it was all over. But literally they had absolutely thumped Sony. Now, how it would have gone on, I can't say, but the Dreamcast would have stood up to the PlayStation for quite some time at least. I certainly think you might have found, I think had they not cancelled it, I think what you would have found is, my suspicion is the Xbox would have failed. Either the Xbox or the GameCube would have failed. One of those two, because you couldn't have had 4 consoles in the marketplace.
Probably the GameCube, I think. Probably because Microsoft could just chuck money at it, which is what they did.
Yeah.
The Xbox was a beta test. It was a public beta test for the Xbox 360. They got that through in the door, and obviously it paid off. It's interesting because maybe. I mean, there's been rumours that there was. I'm not sure if this is true. I think maybe it's been confirmed or true, but that they were tentatively preparing to make Grand Theft Auto 3 for the Dreamcast, and when it became apparent that it wasn't going to be a successful console long term, that's when they started developing it for the PS2. I don't know how true that was, but I guess, as you're saying, Riven, if it carried on.
Well, they did release Grand Theft Auto 2 on the Dreamcast, so
that's right.
You never quite know with that one. I think it may have done quite well as well. So I think the thing was the Dreamcast had it had done really well. It hadn't done that well in Japan, but it was doing really well in the West. And that Christmas they'd done really well, but because it was doing badly in Japan, in fact, I think it only sold like 2.5 million or something units in Japan. Basically, Sega Japan said, "No, that's it, we've finished." And they later admitted that was a huge mistake, and they did try and revert that decision, but the shareholders overruled them, because I think a couple of them in Sega Japan did admit in sort of meetings that basically they'd screwed up when they said they'd cancelled the Dreamcast. They said they shouldn't have done it, but they said that was a poor mistake, because as soon as they saw the Western sales, they realised what a mistake they'd made, but then it was too late. But perhaps Grand Theft Auto 3 might have been in development. I can't say for sure. Oddly enough, I used to know a few people at Rockstar, but I'd never heard of that rumour before. I can't ask, because I used to work in Edinburgh. But I can't ask that question anymore. But that's an interesting one. It may have been. I have no idea if that's true or not, or just a made-up rumour.
Probably made up. But yeah, I mean, it's even in the UK, I think specifically that the Dreamcast was successful. I think a lot of people I don't think that bought one were even aware there was a Saturn, to be honest. I think it was people had their Mega Drive. They probably stuck with it till about 96, 97. And then the current console at that point, in their eyes, unless it was different for us, with people that read the magazines and kept up with everything, we knew about everything going on. But for someone that was just, had their Mega Drive and that was their game thing, and then they got into 96, 97 when they were suddenly seeing this PlayStation thing being advertised everywhere. They thought, oh, is that the new Mega Drive then? And they would go out and they would buy. At this point, they'd be in their late teens or early 20s. That perfect demographic. The people that had 200 quid, or 300 quid when it came out to drop on it. And they probably bought the PlayStation, and they weren't even aware of a Saturn, unless they, hardcore went into Virgin Megastore and went to the games section there, and they had the tiny little Saturn bit next to the huge wall of PlayStation.
Yeah, that was the end when you just literally had the TV rack of Saturn games, and then everything else was PlayStation or PC.
Yeah, and then they had the PlayStation, and then they got to about 99 and thought, oh, Sega are coming back. Wow, I used to love that when I was 12. And there's a Sonic game as well. Oh, Sonic was cool. I used to love that. I wonder where Sega had been for the last few years. That's brilliant. 200 quid, and I can go on the internet. Brilliant. And I think that's a way bigger majority of people than I think the hardcore nerd Sega fans that would have bought it like us. I don't know if you guys bought one when it came out. I got one when it came out.
I was a hardcore Nintendo fan up till the Saturn, and we were debating which one to get. But basically, because the N64 was so late, we opted. I mean, we did have a look at the PlayStation for a while. We thought maybe, and then we Saturn. But in the end, we went with the Saturn. But yeah, I was a Super Nintendo fan originally, and previously an Amiga and Spectrum. But originally, I was a SNES. But because the N64 was so late, we ended up getting a Saturn instead. So that was one of the failures of Nintendo. They just didn't get the N64 into market soon enough.
So late and overpriced.
Yeah.
250 quid, no less, in the UK when it came out. And then they dropped it to 99 9 months later. So didn't get any freebies like they do now, like being out uproar now. They're just like, yep, you've lost 150 quid.
Apparently, a few people write angry letters, and they did get 3 games if they did so.
Oh, did they?
Yeah, where a few people said I paid 100 quid for this, and you've just suddenly cut the price 2 weeks later. And a couple of them did get like a free copy of Mario Kart or something. Yeah, I remember reading a few letters about that at the time. But basically, unless you wrote a very angry letter to Nintendo, you weren't getting anything.
I think it was like 150 by the summer as well. They really desperately chopped, because Sony were just the experts but as soon as the N4 came out, they dropped the PS1 to 130 quid.
Well, the problem was the N64, it costs so much less than the PlayStation, but then parents would be, well, hold on. What's the point in buying a machine that's going to be 150 quid, but then the games cost £65? Run by a PlayStation, there's so many more games, and they're from £20 upwards.
Well, I got an N64 first. I got it before I got a PlayStation, funnily enough.
I did, actually, yeah.
It was because I played, my mate had one, and in the summer of 97, so only a few months after it came out here, I played Turok and Mario Kart. That's the 2 games he got with it. And I was absolutely blown away. I've never seen anything like it. I'd seen, obviously, play PC games. There was first-person shooters, but Turok looked like it made Doom look 10 years old. 10 years old, And Mario Kart was absolutely amazing. I mean, it's still my favourite Mario Kart to this day. A lot of the magazines didn't like it, weirdly, but I thought it was great. And then the GoldenEye came out, and that blew me away. And I was a bit of an N64 fanboy, then I got a PlayStation later on. But yeah, it was interesting. There's a whole other episode there. How could they have made the N64 more successful? That would be the next one.
Yeah, maybe add in RGB support. No, I went... because I went Saturn, got the Saturn. I think in '99 I got the N64, and then I didn't get a PlayStation. I didn't get any PlayStation consoles till I entered the industry, because up until that point I had a massive bias against Sony.
Oh, good on you.
once I entered the industry, I realised you couldn't have a bias anymore, because we were testing on all the platforms. So I just said shove it, and because I hadn't played a PS2 that much at that point, I just went out and bought a PS2 and bought a ton of games to sort of make sure I got up to speed with it, because everyone else been playing. Because it was one of the things, when I got into the industry, I realised you can't have preferences. You've just got to know what the games are good and what are bad. The whole fanboyism. It annoys me these days now when I talk to people who are fanboys, because I'm just like, your opinion is worthless now, because you need to. It's not about what platform. It's just about the games and how good they are or not.
Yeah, you should embrace all of them, because you're going to miss out on a ton of games that the other guy has. You should just be like, love all of them. Be happy that they compete against each other, because that drives up, when it's an arms race like it is. I mean, Microsoft were quite happy to put all these stupid restrictions on you for the Xbox One. They didn't drop all that because they were nice.
No, they did drop till it because Sony were absolutely hammering them.
Exactly. So at the end of the day, they're corporate, heartless entities that just want your money, unfortunately.
Yeah, well, what might be interesting is whether the Xbox One will be the last Xbox console, because that's been absolutely trounced, and I can't see it coming back.
I mean, they've stopped releasing sales figures, haven't they?
And they've stopped doing first-party games as well.
Yeah,
Trev, I don't think they've stopped releasing sales figures because they're so high.
So Stu, you have a shop that has Xbox One. So, do you get an impression of a ratio of the PS4 stuff selling against the Xbox One?
Well, it's definitely the PlayStation 4 will sell twice as much of whatever game. And I mean, at the moment, my main machine is the Xbox One X, and I'm really enjoying that. And I love the way it all works, and I think they've really turned it around. But
Too late though, isn't it?
They've turned it around just a little bit too late.
I mean, you can't. A year of screw ups really is what.
Exactly. And the biggest thing for me was, well, the Xbox One is a less powerful machine that costs 50 quid more. Well,
exactly, yeah.
It was just a no-brainer. Get the PlayStation 4, and that's the route I went. And it wasn't until 2 or 3 years later, and I thought, actually, I want to get an Xbox One as well now. And
this generation,
I picked up one, and I went back and I played the Gears of War 4. I played the Halo 5.
Yeah.
Got the Forzas and a few of the other exclusives. And for those games, damn, I really enjoyed it. It was an absolutely sort of great machine, and I'm still enjoying playing it now. I'm a little bit, oh god, I've got to set up my machine if I want to play God of War, which that's a game on my list, and that I want to pick up, and that's the reality of it.
Have to try it.
Well, have you tried any of the backwards compatibility games like Panzer Dragoon Auto, by the way? Because
Well, I did play that on the Xbox 360.
No, but they've completely redone it for Xbox One. Apparently, it looks really, really shiny.
So I've got that here. But I remember I watched a Digital Foundry video of Elder Scrolls Morrowind, and it just looked. It looked very, very
good.
It did look very good, but it just maybe looked like the PC version where it was in a higher resolution, and it's nice that they're making all these games look shinier and things like that. But I tell you what game I do want to get is SSX3.
Yeah, just announced
or get it for the Xbox to play on my Xbox One X, because that's meant to look absolutely amazing.
Well, I think the main thing with something like Morrowind is the increase in frame rate, because the games can now run at their frame limit. I think
that's right. Yeah.
I think it was unlocked. I think it can hit 60. I think now, where it couldn't really ever unless you were looking at the floor on the original Xbox, which you do a lot, to be fair, with the control. And then you got even Red Dead Redemption, like that can now be a fairly solid 30 frames a second, and it can even scale up to 4K. Basically, like you say, make it look kind of like a PC version would. But it means that it can constantly display the high resolution assets and not sort of, feed them to you when it can manage it. But it still looks good on an Xbox 360 to me. But yeah, that's something I need to try on my Xbox One as well. But my PS4 Pro tends to be the console that I use, mainly for the VR, to be honest. But it's interesting because that generation, I don't know if we're in a kind of a 0.5 generation now, that's one of the few where the most powerful console has kind of won with the PS4. Was the difference isn't as big as like it has been in the past, but that was the better performing console, and that kind of won if you count the Pro V1X as a new kind of half generation. That's now switched, but normally that doesn't happen. The Wii one, the PlayStation 1, NES kind of, and only really in America or in Japan.
Yeah, PlayStation 2 beat the Xbox, which is more powerful, and
Game Boy v Lynx and Game Gear and all that. So it's unusual. It'd be interesting. You think there'll be another console generation after this one? It would just be
there is going to be. I think it's just going to be a while away yet. I think
like a mobile phone type thing, just a slightly better version, and that'll be it then. It'll just keep being incremental.
It's going to be interesting. The problem is that graphics can't go really that much further. They won't admit it, but we can't get photorealistic graphics unless there's some sort of pre-built library, because the cost, I mean, I knew it from my end in development when we used to, the cost was just beginning to spiral out of control. It was just costing too much to produce games. You were basically putting all your eggs in one basket, and if that game didn't sell, well, your studio was bankrupt.
And the smaller studios now, I guess they kind of resort to retro styled
because you can't afford to put all spanky 3D graphics. You just go bust.
Okay, well, there you go, everybody. That was got a fascinating discussion there on how Sega might have ended up. It seems they would still fail for the most part. I think there were some fundamental things about their management, really, wasn't it? And the US versus Japan, I think, was what really kind of killed them in the end. And it would have been difficult to overcome that. But thanks again, Riven, for joining us. We really
no worries, pleasure Always, guys. Nice to speak to you again. It's been a pleasure.
Where can we catch you on YouTube?
Randomised Gaming. I'm just actually about to put a 1,000 subscribers thank you up video after that.
Oh, cool.
Shortly.
Oh, well done.
Yeah, because we finally hit. So we are steadily progressing, and I've got a new. So if you stay tuned to the channel in the next few weeks, we've got a big Saturn video coming. So
oh, great!
It's going to be detailing just about every quirk and just about everything you need to know if you're a sort of beginner. But it's not quite ready yet. We're still doing a few tweaks to it. Still got about a week and a half's work of work. Yeah, so stay tuned. But yep, Randomised Gaming. Look up our blog as well. It's blog, YouTube. Just stay tuned to the channel and our blog.
Cool. You know what? I would love to see. You might have explained already, but the interesting Mega CD sort of 50 and 60 hertz comparisons, because that's something I don't think I've seen it in anywhere else. So
no, the problem is we don't yet have an NTSC Mega CD. We need to get a Japanese one, because I've got a Japanese Mega Drive. We've got a Japanese 32X, so we just need the Mega CD too at the minute, but we can't find one at the minute. But yes. If we can do, because I've already got a few US games and we've got a few Japanese games, although we need to get CDX as well, the cartridge, or we need to get it modded.
Yeah.
I must admit, I'm not overly keen on getting my consoles modded these days, but maybe if I can get one that doesn't drill holes in the casing.
Yeah, you don't want to ruin the look of it, do you?
I've got that.
Cool. So if you're really into sort of especially comparison videos, Randomised Gaming is absolutely amazing for that. And also, Riven, make sure you check out Burning Road on the PS.
I will check out Burning Road.
The closest thing to a Saturn game on the PlayStation, yeah. That's a really interesting game. But yeah, check out Randomised Gaming. Stu, where can you catch us?
Okay, consoleshock.net. You can find us on Facebook, Console Shock. Well, just search Console Shock, and then you can also we're on Stitcher and iTunes as well. So be sure to download us, subscribe, and leave us reviews. That's what love people say.
We haven't got one, have we? I think.
I don't know.
Yeah,
I don't know.
Be nice.
I don't know how to find out, but yeah, leave us one.
Great, nice one as well, please. Cool. Right. Thanks, guys, and we'll see you in the next one. Take care, everyone.
Cheers. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.